Kia ora koutou. Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan Osterman. I am a teaching fellow at Te Here Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and I'm very happy to be here today with Kaeden Watts. And have a lovely long blurb about Kaeden, so excuse me if I'm looking to the side while I read it out. So Kaeden whakapapas to Ngāti Tuwharetoa, Ngāti Maniapoto and Tūhoe. He's a policy advocate and campaigner. He's currently a manager at Taumata Arowai, the Water Services Authority. He's an associate research fellow at the University of London. Got a really wide range of experience with climate action. Currently a board trustee of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa. He's a member of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on climate change, and in recent years was the climate change implementation lead at the Ministry of Health, board co-chair and strategic advisor for 350 Aotearoa, and taking steps back further, many other things as well. Huge experience, and so definitely really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, Kaeden.
Kia ora, Jonathan. What a generous introduction. Very much appreciated. I can introduce myself if that's and sort of expand on that if that's helpful for the kōrero.
Please, that would be great. Thanks, Kaeden.
Awesome. Well, ka pai. Well, kia ora koutou, ko ai huri tēnei no Ngāti Tuwharetoa, Ngāti Maniapoto, ngā tūhoe hoki, ko Ngāti Hari tōku hapu ki Taumata Nui. Ko Taumata Nui, tōku kāinga engari e noho ana au ki te whanganui a tara. Ko Kaeden Watts, talking away. Awesome to be a part of this kōrero, and thanks, Jonathan, for bringing me into it. Super exciting. So you've touched on a lot of those hats that I wear, but to sort of jump into that, there's a connecting feature of those many hats, and it's the ability to contribute to this sort of theory of change, I suppose, that I've built up over time around climate action, Indigenous rights, and the health of our people, and all peoples, right, in Aotearoa and beyond. And so, I grew up in sort of born around Taumata Nui and then moved on to Napier, quite disconnected from our whakapapa. It took quite a while to understand that reclamation journey and what it meant to be Māori. But I always had a curiosity, I suppose, about people in the environment and how culture was shaped, how people fit in within community, what our role is, I suppose, as people, and kaitiaki, or practicing kaitiakitanga for the environment. And it wasn't until I went to university where I sort of made the connection, which was I was sitting in class one day and there was a lecture about different ideologies, but we had touched on climate change, and I was really in the rabbit hole of climate change at this point of my studies, and I went, oh my God, the same things that have led to the environment being in the current state that it's in, the exact same drivers that have led Māori and indeed Indigenous peoples wider to be in the position that we and they are in as well. Those drivers are synonymous, right? So we're talking about colonization, capitalism, exploitation of the tile, all those different things. And so I went, wow, okay, so if these are the drivers that have led us both to get to this point, both areas to get to this point, which are indistinguishable from one another, I couldn't look to those same processes to have the solutions to those problems, right? I couldn't put my confidence that we're going to find our answer in capitalism or continued exploitation. And it threw me into a deep dive to, well, what are those solutions? And I started to really find them in reclamation of our identity, understanding our relationship to the environment, us as people, and indeed what it means to be Māori or Indigenous here in Aotearoa, and what that meant for all peoples, how we all fit into that relationship. So yes, that sent me into a big deep dive, and I threw myself into the advocacy world, and so I got my come up in a little organisation called Te Arawhatu back in the day, and we're a group of young advocates, Māori and Pacific, with our sights set on targeting things at the highest level of climate negotiations, which of course was at the United Nations through COPs and UNFCCC events. UNFCCC being the climate change arm for the United Nations just as an FYI. And so we had our sights set on that. I had my first journey to one of those sort of gatherings back in 2018, and it was a pretty incredible crash course into just the pure inequity that climate change is, and what that meant for Indigenous people as well. I got the beauty of sharing kai and laughs with Indigenous people from all across the world, and it was almost like holding up a mirror, and realizing, oh wow, our experiences are synonymous. So clearly we're all onto something with challenging these issues. Those experiences helped me dive deeper into these ideas. You know, what did it mean to be in relationship with the environment, to be in relationship with myself, with my people as well. And when I started really focusing on that, the answers started to come. They would drip feed from there to me. Especially by people doing this a lot longer than I've been doing it. You know, I'm not the first person to have this light bulb moment of realization. Far from it. Took my own tera roku along with a dear friend, Nikia Randall, to the following year's COP25 in Spain, and continued that journey on, and just sort of went from there. Partway along the journey, I should say, the intention of contributing to these international kōrero was to understand what was happening at that level, what challenges we were facing, and bring those knowledges and those lessons back home for our people to implement here. And I'm still understanding what that looks like all these years on. Came back here, threw myself into all the campaigning, advocacy, and all those kind of conversations and kaupapa. And at some point along the way, I decided my skill set was better used using tools on the inside of these systems to help tinker and change them, and negotiate with those who had the power, really, to help them understand what our points of view were, to help us incrementally get to the place that we, who knew these problems were rife and challenging, where we wanted to be, what the vision was that we had. So yes, I've found myself in a number of different organisations all across government, working on health, climate change, Indigenous rights, through Crown entities, councils, so on. I've been in the NGO world for a number of years, supporting in different kaupapa. Even went to the private sector for a little bit to see what it was like to use the tools that they had available within Big Four entities, to understand what we could do using those levers to help our people. And all these years later, I am still understanding what are the best tools you can use that are available to help us get there. And I have come to understand that all of them are useful, right? They're all useful, and we just need people playing in all those spaces. People who think like us, people who want to see change, who have a vision for what the environment and our people could be doing and could be in relationship with each other to thrive. We need people in all those spaces. So touch on a number of hats that I wear currently, Jonathan, and that probably is reflective of that theory of change quite vividly. So yes, that kind of brings us to today. And so the focus at the moment is still challenging those systems, right, and understanding the current economic structures that we operate under don't work for us as marginalised people in Aotearoa. What could be a way that we could rethink that actually works for our people? How do we place priority on the environment and people as, I don't want to say the currency, but as the priority in a wellbeing economy, as opposed to money, right? What does it look like to actually fully protect the health of our people and the health of our environment, to know where we come from? When we build solutions like that and implement at a local level, you see some groundbreaking change. And I guess to come full circle in that kōrero, that really distance my confidence in high-level organisations like the UNFCCC to hold the solutions or be the vehicle to get to where we want to get to. It's local, right? It's local is where you see that real beautiful change, building community, knowing where you're from, all those different things. And And that's the ground that I operate in at the moment.
Nice, thank you. There's lots of richness in there, and I'm hearing, so one of the terms I use is like an ecosystem of climate action, and I can hear all these different strands or niches within that ecosystem that you've sort of explored. So that's really nice just to have laid out like that, and sort of finding your place within that, insider, outsider, international, local, public, private, all of these different strands. So great to hear you speaking that out. And maybe as we keep going, we might sort of weave back with that. Yeah, I mean, maybe, given that you have already touched on it, if we speak about that big picture of Māori approaches to climate action, and you've already spoken about that sort of interweaving of climate action with Indigenous rights, Indigenous justice, tino rangatiratanga. Yeah, do you want to just talk a little bit more about how you feel that these interconnections shape climate action by Māori?
Yeah. Yes. Well, there's so many directions you can take with it. I went back to one of our Māori Maniapoto on the weekend, and we were having a discussion as to what a taiao strategy for Maniapoto could look like, right? That was one of the kōrero that we were having as a rōpū. And I started off by saying, look, these are really hard conversations to have. What does it look like to have taiao-based strategy? Because it is so broad, and it is the system that we operate in. Well, to get a system that reflects what we want for the taiao and ourselves as well as tangata, is so broad because it touches so many areas, right? Like our health is we'll well know, our health is linked to the environment, right? So if our environment is not healthy, then we as people aren't healthy. And I think you're starting to see that quite intensely in the modern day as well. And that stretches through a lot of different mediums, right? And if I'm speaking for me as someone Māori who didn't grow up around our whakapapa in our environment, but has since sort of taken those steps to reclaim. If I don't have access to my whenua, that can take a toll on my physical health. I can't get into our marakai, right, and mess around with our whenua, get my hands in the dirt if I don't have access to it, or if it's not healthy, right? My mental health is going to take a tremendous toll if I can't access my whenua due to whatever reason, taken extreme weather event that has ruptured the whenua due to climate change. My mental health is going to take a hit because I can't access my culture through my whenua anymore. I can't practice our reo. I don't know our tikanga. I don't know our waiata, etc., if I don't have access to that whenua. And so when you start to have that sort of conversation, you start to realise how big a taiao-based strategy can be. But that's quite cool at the same time, I think, because it takes that systems level approach, right? That's exactly what we want to do. We want to understand that all of those things are interconnected. And so they should be approached as one. We should not be separating our health from that environment. And it doesn't matter where you are. Your environment is your environment. If you have access to marakai, if you have access to trees and walkways, if you have access to community gathering spaces, these are all terrific things for our physical and our mental health. So that kind of kōrero is the foundations for how we approach things in Te Ao Māori, right? So that's the basis. And sort of going back to those conversations that I was initially having, first coming into this space back in 2018, with other Indigenous people across the world, again, these were synonymous kōrero, right? It's not just, these conversations aren't just restricted to the Pacific, to Aotearoa. This is happening all over the world because we've always been this way. We've always had this understanding. And it's not until recently where those processes of exploitation capitalism came in and ruptured that connection, did we start to see that disconnect. Did we start to see ourselves as above the environment? Did we start to see the environment as something to be exploited, to be conquered, as something that I have a right to, as a person? It's there to serve me. that's the foundations for the systems that we operate in now, is how can I get the most out of the finite things that are there, as opposed to seeing yourself as a part of it, right? And so those are the foundations that drive the way that we approach things as in Te Ao Māori. Those practices have been happening ever since we got here, ever since we rocked up to Aotearoa. Those have been practices, the understanding that we can't take too much because we're just a little part of this wider ecosystem, and so we give back to the environment as well, right? And it's funny that now I've worked in a lot of places, and I've worked on climate change strategies in quite a few places now at different sort of levels of government. And I always crack up at the point that we get to in the development of strategy where we go full circle back to, we probably just need to take less, right? That's where we always end up as the ultimate solution. And I've been in these big negotiating rooms at the UN level and watched, all these countries having a do with each other about trying to innovate our way out of this thing, when the answer's there all along. And it's really easy, right? It's a really easy message to hold on to, which is to have respect for your environment, as if it was another person, right? You wouldn't do the things that we do to our environment to somebody else. And so why would we do it to this other part of our ecosystem that is no different from what we are? And I always find it hilarious that we come back to this point of going, well, yes, there are innovative practices that we can implement to reduce emissions, to do X, Y, Z. But if COVID taught us anything, if there was one nugget that we could take away from it, it was taking less from our environment healed it, and therefore healed us, right? Those whakaaro have their foundations in Indigenous thought, right? That's whakaaro that's been practiced for thousands and thousands of years. It's no different now. Yes, we have different tools available to us, and we operate in a different system that views things differently, but the solutions are still exactly the same.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. I like how you were sort of weaving that together there, and stepping beyond some of, in certain realms, how climate action is understood can be sort of made quite narrow, but you're sort of opening it out. And I've got in my mind one of my follow-up questions draws on a Mohawk author by the name of Ben Powless. And so as you're talking, one of the things he says is he speaks about a positive alternative vision of Indigenous knowledge, rights and lifeways. And what you're saying just there, I feel like it's sort of resonating with that sort of on that positive side. And then I'm thinking about, well, what's stopping that from sort of really, shifting things sort of globally. And that's, the current status quo. And he's another point that he talks about, the history of oppression and dispossession. And he speaks about how Indigenous action in the climate space and beyond is shaped by both of those, both that sort of oppression, dispossession, and that positive alternative vision that, the values of Te Ao Māori in this case in Aotearoa. I mean, does that ring true to you, that sort of manifesting in both these spaces, or how would you sort of think about those sorts of ideas?
I might ask you to expand on that question slightly, if that's okay.
Yeah, just maybe I wasn't necessarily as clear as I could be. So I think that
you probably were.
that climate action, as well as action for rangatiratanga, Indigenous rights, and so forth, that it is sort of both the yes and the no. That it's the yes of this Māori way of being, if you like, and Indigenous ways of being, but also the no of sort of responding to colonisation, and that's sort of always going to be a part of the action that needs to be taken. Would you agree with that, or would you frame that differently?
No, I totally agree with it. And I think an important kōrero in there is, and I'll pull in an example shortly of what that can look like, but I think where people get stuck with this conversation around sort of tino rangatira in the modern context, especially as it pertains to whatever it may be, climate change, systems change, non-Māori seeing themselves in these solutions, it's quite complex to implement in our current context. And that tino rangatiratanga example is quite an interesting one. Oh, I mean, ultimately, right, what that looks like, tino rangatiratanga mana motuhake, it will look different for everybody, but ultimately, it's the reverberations of that kōrero in the land, right? Like the foundations, the genesis of that kōrero is in the land. Protecting the land, being in relationship with the land, having access, importantly, to your land. And I think that access part is where we get really messy in this conversation around not just Indigenous rights, but how all people sort of fit in this ecosystem. I suppose to clarify that point, we live in a context at the moment that is really individualized, right? It's very individualized. Ownership is a really tricky thing, and it's very difficult for us to but understand how different models of being can work in this heavily individualized society that we're in right now. I mean, a slight tangent, but I mean, our tax system is a really good example of this, right? Like we favour owning individually or maybe at a whānau level assets, right? Land, infrastructure. That's how you get ahead, right? In New Zealand in the modern context, and we're especially bad for it here in Aotearoa with our tax system and how we sort of put all of our chips into owning at an individual level land and assets. And has that worked? No. and I'd love for anyone to point me to one society that has employed capitalism as their main ideology, right, behind the economics, and tell me that they've got a fair and just society for all people. We don't. It's just not how it works. Like the foundations of that ideology is built on exploitation. Someone or something has to be exploited for someone else to rise up in that system of capitalism. That's its principles, right? However, we weren't always like that, right? In Aotearoa, our blueprints for how we existed in community and in relationship with each other are really different and really go against that, right? And you don't actually have to look too far into the past to see how that functioned. Papakainga housing is a really good example to contrary that exact point that I made about the individual asset and land ownership model. Owning things together, right? Owning things together as communities and sharing and placing that priority on looking after one another and the land itself, right? Being in relationship with one another. That's how our hapu function. That's how our iwi function. For the most part, it's not until we've come to understand that to sort of get back to that place that we want to get to as Māori, you sort of had to play this game, right? So we have to engage in this current economic model that we have, which means to get to that vision of, say, papakainga housing or shared ownership, hapu iwi, hapori ownership of the land. You do have to engage in this economic model slightly to get to that point. That's the only way you're going to get that land secured or get that land back. But I want to stress that I believe that is the solution, is that shared ownership model of doing things. But I also want to stress that has a role for everybody to play in, right? For everybody. And if you go back to the start of our colonization story, that was the understanding when European settlement first began here. And I mean, very early days, just after sort of the whaler economy had rocked up in the north, and we started seeing people down here where I live currently in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington. We started to see European settlement happen here down in Te Whanganui-a-Tara. And at first, I mean, the intentions of Māori were to not end up in the situation that we're in now, but have that shared understanding of, you can be in community here as well. And it wasn't until things started rupturing, and we had, questionable behaviours happening from settlers, that we started to go down this track of, okay, maybe we need our own governing models. That wasn't the way that it was intended to be, though, when that colonisation story first started happening. It was meant to be in community. You can still have that, right? You can still have that in our current model, but it's complex. And the main challenge that we have, that I've always sort of found myself facing, is that it's far easier to tell somebody that the system we have now isn't broken, it just needs tinkering, than it is to explain to somebody this system isn't working, we need to build up a new one. That's a very challenging thing to do, to help someone build that vision, especially when their priority might be, I don't even have enough money to get food on the table this week, right? And that's the reality of what we're facing at the moment. So it's gonna take time to get there. But what gives me quite a bit of reassurance is that we have a well-practiced model here in Aotearoa, a well-practiced blueprint for how that can be done traditionally.
Yeah, nice, thank you. So you've spoken already from a personal perspective, and I think that sort of flows through and sort of more broadly among among Māori in terms of approaches to climate action. We've got these diverse approaches. Obviously, that's true for Pākehā as well. Do you feel like the balance of approaches among these different forms of climate action, do you feel like it's different in Te Ao Māori compared to Te Ao Pākehā?
Yeah, I do in many ways. Depends where you are, really, and it depends which community you're engaged in. I'd rock up to certain iwi. When I worked at Wellington City Council, I had quite a bit to do with Ngāti Tuwharetoa, and they had a very good model of engagement with public sector entities at like a council level and a central government level too, to be fair, to get the projects that they wanted to get going that were Ngāti Toa led, had really great benefits for Ngāti Toa, but indeed everybody, getting those across the line in partnership. They were very good at partnering with particular people within these councils who could see the vision for what they were trying to create and could see the benefits. That they're very proactive in that approach. And then I've rocked up to other iwi who wanted nothing to do with the Crown, and they're my own iwi, and back in Tūhoe, are very much along that line where we're very strong in our tūhoetanga, and so though are confident that those solutions are already there, and often take the we're just going to progress this because we know what's best for our rohe, which is true, right? Both of those things can be true at the same time. So in that spectrum within Te Ao Māori, I've kind of seen both of the extremes, I suppose, for how they can be achieved. Within non-Māori spaces, it's fascinating as well, because you almost see the exact same thing as well. If I was to take advocacy, like the advocacy NGO sector as an example, you can see like a lot of climate action organisations that will prioritise their time in local action as a way to get there. I'm thinking umbrella organisations that look after marakai, for example, are a very good example, who will do practical things to feed their community, but will also tie that in with kōrero about systemic issues and why it's important to invest our time in community and growing our kai, XYZ, understanding where our kai comes from, our whakapapa, all these different things. And then on the other hand, organisations that I've represented, I'll take 350 as an example, who understand that local context and know it's important and work at that local context, but it very much also got their sights set on our highest level of government, right, Pākehā government, to target and try and find ways to change things legislatively or in the policy realm. So I think in many ways, I don't think they're too different from one another, right? So if I was to go back to the last answer I had as well, I think a lot of those solutions have strong synergies within Māori spaces and non-Māori spaces. The genesis might be different, right? Like the genesis of what's happening in a Māori space might be because this particular iwi or hapu wants to look after its people and its environment relevant to its arohe, right? Or we might have Māori organisations just targeting outcomes for Māori because that's the focus. Whereas these ones over here in the non-Māori spaces might have a different, genesis to them as well. But ultimately, they're doing the same thing, right? They're both building community. They're both, in many ways, place-based and targeting different levels of the system. I have spent a lot of my career so far operating in both and being the translator between the two. I used to do that at Wellington City Council quite a bit. That was nearly my main role was to bring those two worlds together in the climate change adaptation space. And it's fascinating how sometimes you can have a room full of people who will come from different kaupapa, who all have their own reasons for being in there. But the umbrella that's brought them in there is always the same, right? They just want what's good for people and planet. And that should really just be the simplest explanation for why we're all in there, is we all just want what's best for our people and for the environment to thrive, for us, for future generations, etc. That's it, right? That's the corridor. And there are many different ways to get there. Then it's just finding out, well, where am I best placed to do that?
Yeah, nice. No, that's great. So, and a couple of points in there would be great to dig further into. And I think maybe now sort of weaving it back into your experience a bit more. So even just that point around your work at Wellington City Council in terms of bridging Te Ao Māori, Te Ao Pākehā, do you want to talk about the challenges of that, the things that you'd like to celebrate about that?
Yes, many challenges, many good things, but many challenges. Look, I'll be very honest. It's quite hard to work in a lot of those spaces. As someone who's Māori, and as you can probably tell, quite fiercely representative of this way of thinking. To navigate systems that don't necessarily always believe that same way of thinking. So I could point to quite a few different places I've worked that this has been the case, but if I was to take two, just to give you sort of two different levels of the system where this has happened. Ministry of Health, so to expand further on that one, I was the climate change implementation lead for the Ministry of Health. So what that meant was we had a strategy that was published not long after I got there, the first climate change and health strategy in Aotearoa. And the next task was to make sure that we were doing the things that we said we would do in the plan. As you can imagine, a climate change and health strategy is extremely broad and difficult to understand what you can do at a central national level when you know the real mahi is happening at the local level. It's when you're operating in these systems, you have access to so much information and people who hold powerful positions, people who can make decisions like that can really change the course of the direction this country is going. And they're sitting at the desk sort of opposite you, right? And then I'll go home to Taumata Nui to travel around the country and see what's really happening at the ground, right? Like what some of these really incredible solutions that communities are putting together are, and then trying to think of ways to represent their whakaaro and use it with the tools that I have on the inside. And that's really challenging. It's a really challenging thing to do. Sort of at the Ministry of Health level, I found myself on the phone just constantly talking to hapu iwi community organisations all across the motu to understand, like, what can I do in here that would help you? This is what I'm hearing. These are the things that are happening in these different spaces. What can I do to help? But it's very challenging because you walk into these communities with that Ministry of Health hat on, and they don't always want to engage. And fair enough, right? These are their solutions, right? And they've done this largely in many ways without the help of government entities, without relying on government entities. It's a challenging space to operate in, but sometimes you can get it right. You can get it really right. And within Wellington City Council, we saw those successes quite a few times, particularly with Ngāti Tuwharetoa and Te Aotearoa, our mana whenua down here in Whanganui Aotearoa here. Like I said, with Ngāti Tuwharetoa, they're very proactive. We're working with Wellington City Council, as was Te Aotearoa as well. And so we had a few different projects that we were doing with both iwi in the adaptation space, but also the climate education space. There are many ways you can bring together the solutions and the whakaaro that those groups hold, right? Iwi hapu, hapuri Māori hold, and use those tools and that funding and that time that people have on the inside of, say, a Wellington City Council to bring those ideas that they have to life. That was a role that I assumed when I went in there. And within those two examples, within Ministry of Health and Wellington City Council, you can probably see a bit of a difference there. At the local level, you saw far more success brought to life than you did at that national level. And I think part of that, right, is because just quite simply, that's where the solutions are, right? They're born in local communities. They're born in those iwi hapu groups as well, because no one knows the land better than they do, right? Who was I as someone who wasn't even born in this at all here, who doesn't know the whakapapa of Ngāti Toa Te Aotearoa, to come in and make these sweeping suggestions about what should happen with the land and with the people as well, right? Your first point of call should probably be going to those who have been there for the longest time. You see it up in Tūwharetoa as well. I had a blessing of having a yarn with somebody last week, a dear friend up there who's doing some cool environmental work. And they're working with private sector entities as well as the local council on behalf of their hapu to understand the original path of riverways, to understand essentially how to restore the awa back to the way that it was going, because it was diverted for economic purposes. But as part of the hapu playing that kaitakitanga role, they've done a whole bunch of whakapapa research into that tile to understand, no, this isn't the natural flow of this awa. We actually need to change it and get it back to its original state, which will have all of these positive impacts for the environment. That's knowledge that's buried deep within, Pūrākau, within Karakia, within Waiata, within Mōteatea, within Waitangi tribunal claims that whānau have shared as part of their settlement process. These are deep knowledges that are held within those who have been there for the longest time. So operating with those entities, I believe, and this is the whakaaro I've taken in my career so far, is to bring those local knowledges to life. What can I do within these entities to bring the vision that they have for their rohe to life? Because it's not for me to come in and assume a solution and then implement it on behalf of somebody else, right? That has to happen in partnership.
Yeah, nice, thank you. Yes, at a really local level, and this sort of maybe reflects back to your earlier point. So, talking about an appreciation of these diverse approaches, but you did sort of say that you came out of the the COP experience, that international sort of level, with a degree of maybe frustration or maybe disillusionment, or a sense maybe that it just wasn't as effective as it could be. Do you want to just briefly talk about that?
Yeah, how long have you got? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, look, it's I think part of that is because I walked into those negotiations as anybody would, 20 years old, extremely hopeful that this is going to be the thing that will save the world, right? Like, especially new to the space. You hear UN, you hear, I don't know, WHO, and you go, wow, this is where the mahi happens. And then I got in there, and it's fascinating, the politicking, the um, the grandstanding, the lack of willingness to um, go that extra mile. This isn't speaking for everybody, by the way. That you have many countries who are in there doing their very best, and I've had the pleasure of meeting a number of ministers, government representatives of other countries who were just doing their absolute best. And within that New Zealand climate negotiation team, I've had the privilege of forming really dear friendships with people who are doing their absolute best for the environment. But if the system's broken, you can be as well intentioned as you want to be. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work, right? And I remember having my sort of moment of understanding that this was not going to be the place that you would see that change. I was at one point the agricultural negotiator for the Indigenous Peoples Forum. For context, the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change for the UNFCCC represents about 580 million, might be more people now, Indigenous peoples all across the world on the basis of climate change within the UN. So at the 2018 and 2019 COP, I was representing our group in agricultural discussions. And I remember sitting at the table. You had the US over here, you had the European Union over here, Japan over here. Everybody's at the table. And then realizing, oh, we're all just fighting for ourselves right now. We're all in this for our own gain as a country, as a group, in our case for Indigenous peoples. There wasn't again, contrasting it with that local level, at the local level, you'll see people coming together under the umbrella wanting to do something different, something supportive, something positive for us and our environment. That was not the genesis of that forum, as far as I could see. That was not the North Star we were all aiming for either in that room. And I remember seeing that and going, damn, this is probably not something substantial is probably not going to come from this. I'll also contradict myself here as well and say, look, it's not all bad. There's some incredible things that have come out of those forums, and you have incredible people doing incredible things. But I would say that it would not be where I'd put all my chips in as to where we're going to find systemic change. It starts with us. It starts with our own communities. It starts with conversations over a cup of tea, over a coffee, and just doing something with what we can control, right? I've been in a lot of those international forums now in different spaces, climate change, human rights, and it's always been the same feeling. I've always walked out of there with the same feeling. But they're important, right? They're important to engage in. It's like I said, with private sector, public sector, local government, we need people everywhere. But it's a cautionary piece of advice to not put all your bets that those systems will be the thing that will create change. It's going to be us who do it.
Yeah, nice. So one thing we haven't touched on is protest. So, maybe it's potentially in the background of some of the things we touched on, but maybe if we just bring that out briefly before we sort of close off. So, talking at the international level there, mainly from that inside perspective, same with council and so forth. In terms of protest, both for yourself as an individual and for Māori more generally, not that you will speak for all Māori, but a sense of the role of protest for climate action. Do you want to just offer a few thoughts around that space?
I mean, hugely important. That's where I got a lot of my come up as well, was in the protest environment. Yeah, hugely important. Hugely important to bring people together under the umbrella of something and to voice, when something's not working for you and for your communities, that it's important to come together and have that voice, right? That's extremely powerful. And domestically, we've seen that lead to a lot of incredible things, right? I mean, you could take, you can pull from many examples as well within Te Ao Māori around hikoi that have led to substantial changes or derailments of ways we were projected to go as a country. Hikoi and protests changed those things. One of the most formative experiences of my life was the Ihu protest in 2019 when I've forgotten the name of the company now that had that land. But anyway, private sector company that owned the land that the mana whenua were living on, that was illegally stolen and then illegally sold to that company. And so a group of cousins came together and said, we need to do something about this, planned their response for years. And when the police showed up to evacuate them, they hit go and everybody knew where they needed to be. I was still a student at that time, dropped everything and went up there and stayed up there for weeks, supporting them with the media, with getting their messages out, with anything that we could do. That led to the return of that whenua into a cultural heritage site, I think status 1, which means nothing can be developed on that. However, exception was taken to the mana whenua still being able to be on that land, right? It's the next best thing you can get to next to a return of the land to the people. But the government bought that land from the private sector company, and that was the solution. You would not have seen that happen if it wasn't for protests. So we absolutely need it. But two things on protests that I think are just important to raise. One is the ask. What are we actually asking for? I've seen protests fall apart really quickly. They had a lot of momentum when they didn't actually know what they were asking for. They were just upset, and rightfully so. But it's important we're smart about it, right? It's important we're strategic. And if we're going to put all this effort into mobilisation, well, what's the vision? Where do we want to get to? Have we got people who know how these systems work so we know what the next thing is that we can ask for and the next thing, so we don't lose that momentum, right? And then it's important that, similar to that first point, but that it's complemented with action within these structures as well, right? It's just as important to have people outside of the building holding people accountable as it is having people inside of the building making the changes for us, right? Well-intentioned changes that get us to the place that we want to get to. All of those roles are so critically important to getting us to that place and to that vision that we want to be at. So I think it's awesome. Some of the most substantive changes that we've seen, at least for us as Māori, who very nearly lost our reo and our connection to our culture, you can point to protest, organising, strategy, and kotahitanga as the way that we flipped that narrative. And now you're seeing that real tāmoko revitalisation, mātauranga revitalisation, connection revitalisation happening. And a lot of that was due to protests and people saying, nah, I've had enough of this. Let's get smart about this. Let's respond. So hugely important role, I think.
Nice. So that's great. As we move to closing off, is there anything else that you feel like you haven't touched on that you'd like to share, whether it be about Māori approaches to climate action generally, or about some of your own experience that you haven't had a chance to touch on in our chat together?
Probably nothing new, but I think just sort of closing with that point that Māori approaches to climate change are well practiced, right? These aren't, although the words climate change are new to us, all of us, and in Te Ao Māori, the ways of looking after our environment and our taiao are not. Those have always been there. And so while climate change is a complex issue, inequity is a complex issue, I believe the solutions to overcoming those issues are not complex, and we overcomplicate them in many ways. If there's one silver lining to where we've found ourselves as a species now, is that responding to these issues together builds up our communities, right? If there's one silver lining to getting in the same room and saying we need to do something about this, is that we're building relationships with each other and we're building up our knowledge about the environment, how to look after it, what's the right thing to do. So the big scary challenges, but some good can come from participating in those spaces too.
Fantastic, and that's an amazing thought to finish on. So thank you so much, Kaeden, for sharing your time, your thoughts, your experience with us today. Definitely really appreciate it.
No worries. Ngā mihi kia koutou. It was awesome to be able to share some whakaaro. And yeah, kia ora, Jonathan. Appreciate it.
Yeah.